palaces and towering stone walls were violently crumbling into dust. Out of the thick, choking smoke emerged a dark, relentless wave of horsemen, striking with terrifyingly precise savagery, erasing ancient empires from the map. The world looked at this sudden devastation and frantically searched for an explanation. Who were these warriors, and how did they move as one single, highly coordinated entity? To understand them, we have to travel back to the land that forged them, the Mongolian steppe. Winter temperatures here plummet fast enough to freeze exposed flesh in a matter of minutes, while blizzards can bury a family's entire livelihood under suffocating snow in a single night. This extreme environment bred a fractured society. Without cities or written laws to enforce order, survival relied entirely on two pillars: the strength of your aristocratic bloodline and a cycle of raiding your neighbors so your own children wouldn't starve. Into this world, a boy named Temujin was born. As the son of a prominent clan chieftain, his early life offered a rare sliver of stability, wrapped in the guaranteed food and protection of his father's rank. But on the steppe, hospitality was often a mask for ambition. After sharing a meal with the rival Tatar tribe, his father realized too late the food was laced with poison. He staggered back to his camp and died in agonizing pain. With the chieftain gone, the clan elders made a cold calculation. A widow and her young children were mouths they chose not to feed. They packed their camp and rode off, leaving Temujin's family to face the freezing wind alone. The system of aristocratic bloodlines, the very thing that defined his status, was the exact mechanism that abandoned him to die. To survive the wilderness, the family scavenged the riverbanks for wild onions, bitter roots, and the carcasses of diseased rodents. Hunger became Temujin's constant companion, a physical pain that taught him that the weak are always prey. His survival drew the nervous attention of the clan that had abandoned him. Fearing his future revenge, they hunted him down and locked his neck and hands into a heavy wooden collar called a kang, parading him through the camp like a rabid dog. During a distraction in the camp, he made a desperate break for freedom. He plunged into a fast, freezing river, the heavy wooden collar floating on the surface and keeping his nose just above the water as armed guards searched the muddy banks. Emerging from that river, Temujin discarded the old rules of lineage. From this point on, the name of a man's father mattered less to him than that man's proven, uncompromising loyalty. Temujin Ujin gathering a following of outcasts who had been broken by the same tribal system. He cemented these ties with a sacred blood oath, becoming blood brothers, or anda, with a boy named Jamuka. As his influence grew, he married his betrothed, Bertay. For the first time since his father's death, Temujin had a true partner and a rare anchor to his humanity. But happiness was fragile. The rival Merkit tribe descended on his camp in a surprise night raid, born of an old grievance. In the chaos, they captured Bertay and tore her away into the darkness. The kidnapping of his wife changed his objective from survival to consolidation. He realized that as long as the tribes remained divided by these petty cycles of raiding, no family would ever be safe. Temujin assembled an unprecedented coalition, convincing powerful warlords and his blood brother, Jamuka, to join a massive rescue mission. Together, they launched a devastating raid and recovered Bertay. This victory allowed Temujin to implement a series of radical policies. Traditionally, a victor secured his power by executing or abandoning a defeated tribe. Temujin instead practiced forced integration. He adopted the orphans of his enemies as his own brothers, physically merging the survivors into his own clan to erase the old tribal boundaries. He then staffed his leadership based entirely on battlefield skill and loyalty. He ignored their birthright, replacing the old system of inherited power with a hierarchy built on merit. This vision cost him his closest friendship. Jamuka, who remained loyal to the old aristocratic ways, eventually turned against him, plunging the steppe into a heartbreaking civil war. By integrating his foes and elevating commoners to generals, Temujin took a group of desperate outcasts and forged them into a unified, invincible war machine. His new army ruthlessly outmaneuvered and crushed the remaining old guard, including the Tatars who had poisoned his father. In the year 1206, the smoke of these tribal wars finally cleared. Tens of thousands of hardened warriors gathered at the Onon River in absolute reverent silence. Because Temujin had systematically dismantled the rivalries of the past, they no longer stood as divided clans. They stood as one nation, and they gave him a new title, Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. The child who had been left to die in the snow had survived by replacing the crumbling foundation of nomadic society with an ironclad meritocracy. By re-engineering his society, Genghis Khan unleashed a unified storm. The powerful, oblivious empires beyond the grass had absolutely no idea it was about to reach their gates. Across this dry, rolling Mongolian steppe, tens of thousands of hardened nomadic warriors were finally united under a single banner. For centuries, life here was defined by the blood feud. Warriors were fiercely loyal only to their specific chieftains and their immediate bloodlines, living in a constant state of petty tribal raids. Genghis Khan looked past his new borders and recognized an internal danger. An aggressive warrior culture left without an external enemy would inevitably turn its weapons upon itself. To prevent this self-destruction, he began systematically dismantling the noble bloodlines and tribal identities that had defined steppe life for generations. To survive the peace he had forged, he had to conquer the world, and that required completely re-engineering the social structure of his people from the ground up. He replaced ancient tribal loyalties with a rigid, mathematics-based military hierarchy. The decimal system grouped men into squads of 10, an arban. 10 arbans formed a company. 10 companies a regiment. Rival tribesmen became brothers. To ensure this, he instituted shared responsibility. If one man fled, all 10 were executed. This shared life-or-death liability replaced ancient tribal allegiance with an unbreakable loyalty to the squad, ensuring every man fought for the survival of the men next to him. The engine of this system was the eradication of aristocratic privilege. Promotions were awarded strictly on merit and tactical brilliance, allowing a shepherd with a talent for strategy to rise and command 10,000 men. By combining forced synchronization with merit-based advancement, Genghis built a highly efficient war machine that functioned independently of noble birthright. While traditional empires relied on heavy, slow-moving infantry led by noblemen, the Mongols utilized the horse archer. These warriors could fire composite bows with lethal accuracy while riding at a full gallop. Their mobility relied on the system seen here. Warriors traveled with a string of fresh horses, swapping mounts to ensure they never exhausted. This allowed the army to cross hundreds of miles of brutal terrain in just days. However, these horsemen initially struggled when they reached the massive, heavily fortified walled cities of the Jin dynasty in China. Genghis adapted by capturing Chinese engineers and offering them their lives in exchange for their knowledge. Soon, the nomadic cavalry was hauling massive siege trains, utilizing catapults and gunpowder bombs to flood and breach enemy fortresses. A meritocratic culture that prioritized practical skill allowed the Mongols to rapidly assimilate foreign technology, turning their enemies' own engineering brilliance against them. To the west, the Khwarezmian Empire stood as a wealthy traditional superpower. Genghis initially sought trade, sending a massive caravan with a message of friendship to their borders. The Khwarezmian Shah responded with a fatal blunder. He executed the Mongol ambassadors, an act considered an unforgivable offense against heaven. Genghis retreated to a sacred mountain to pray for 3 days. When he descended, he turned the full weight of the Mongol war machine toward the west. This invasion became a collision between an entitled old-world aristocracy and a hyper-disciplined meritocratic superpower. Shah Muhammad made the error dividing his army to garrison individual cities because he feared internal rebellion from his own nobles more than he feared the Mongol invasion. Genghis exploited this paranoia. He trusted his merit-promoted generals to lead independent columns, executing synchronized strikes from multiple angles simultaneously. In a tactical masterstroke, Genghis and his veterans rode directly into the seemingly impossible Kizilkum Desert, emerging like a ghost behind their lines. When the Mongols suddenly appeared at the gates of Bukhara, seen here, the city panicked. Genghis rode into the Great Mosque, declaring himself the punishment of God for their sins. The Mongols used their newly acquired siege tactics to dismantle the empire's glittering capitals. They employed human shields, firebombs, and river diversions to systematically erase these cities from the map. The annihilation of the Khwarezmian Empire demonstrated the effectiveness of the Mongol system. While the Shah's forces were crippled by internal distrust and rigid hierarchies, Genghis Khan's merit-based command structure allowed for the total, synchronized destruction of a traditional superpower. Look at a map of the 13th century. From the icy shores of the Pacific Ocean all the way to the green plains of Eastern Europe, one continuous banner stretched across nearly 12 million square miles. But when Genghis Khan took his final breath in 1227, the lands he conquered sat on a knife's edge. Historically, nomadic empires fractured into civil war the moment their founding warlord died, split apart by greedy heirs. The Mongol elite faced an existential logistical nightmare. How do you govern a territory so vast that a single courier takes months just to ride from one border to the other? A massive army can burn a city to the ground, but military force alone cannot manage taxes or stop local rebellions. Without a fast, reliable way to communicate across the steppe, the empire was virtually guaranteed to tear itself apart. To survive, the Mongol leadership had to make a drastic pivot. They needed to stop operating as an endless cavalry charge and start building a meticulous, permanent state. They anchored this new bureaucracy in stone. Under Genghis's successor, Ögedei, the Mongols established a permanent, heavily fortified capital at Karakorum. From this new seat of power, the administration realized that holding the earth together required a flawless circulatory system. They had to engineer a communication network fast enough to prevent the empire from collapsing under its own weight. They started by enforcing the yasa, a rigid legal code applying equally to herdsmen and princes. Theft, betrayal, and desertion were punished by death, locking the vast territories into absolute fear. But brutal discipline was balanced with cold pragmatism. The Mongols cared only about results. Captured engineers and mathematicians were promoted to run the treasury. They also allowed absolute religious freedom, calculating that letting subjects pray to their gods was the easiest way to prevent insurgency. This combination of lethal force and calculated tolerance locked the continent into a tightly controlled stability. Historians call this deeply integrated era the Pax Mongolica, or the Mongol Peace. For the very first time in human history, a merchant could load a heavy caravan on the shores of the Mediterranean and travel all the way to the Pacific coast of China without a single hostile border. The true engine driving this new global economy was the YAM, a highly optimized, high-speed postal relay system. This map shows how the network functioned. The Mongols built hundreds of relay stations across the continent, spacing them exactly a day's ride apart to form a continuous, unbroken chain. Couriers carried a paisa, an imperial passport tablet, guaranteeing fresh horses and safe shelter at any station. By swapping horses daily, riders never stopped. Intelligence that once took a year to cross the continent now arrived in weeks. The YAM evolved from a military tool into a circulatory system for commerce, facilitating the rapid westward transfer of Chinese financial technologies like paper money. It also allowed navigational tools like the magnetic compass to reach new markets, while Persian doctors, astronomers, and engineers safely navigated the continent. By heavily protecting these routes and removing all friction from long-distance travel, the Mongol administration successfully engineered the world's first high-speed global supply chain. But a perfectly protected, frictionless trade network carries a hidden cost. Extreme connectivity cuts both ways. A microscopic stowaway hijacked this pristine global network, the Yersinia pestis bacteria. The biological supply chain was devastatingly simple. Fleas carrying the bacteria hitched rides on rats, and those rats were perfectly adapted to follow human commerce. These vectors hid deep inside the grain sacks and silk bundles of the very merchant caravans traveling along the YAM. Because the Mongol relay system allowed carts and riders to move continuously, infected rats and fleas traversed massive, previously impassable geographic barriers long before they or their hosts died off. The administrative machine built to govern the Earth unintentionally engineered a perfect superhighway, allowing a lethal disease to spread as fast as a galloping horse. Look at the trade map now. As the Black Death exited these highly efficient arteries, it swept outward, devastating the populations of Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. The specific logistical networks constructed to keep the largest empire in history alive became the exact mechanism of its devastation. The Mongol administration succeeded in linking East and West. They birthed the early global economy and proved the economic power of a deeply integrated world. But they also left behind a permanent warning. The highly optimized systems we build today to share wealth, move goods, and maintain power are the exact same systems that leave us vulnerable to sudden global collapse. The strongest empires in history are rarely defeated by outside armies. More often, they collapse under the weight of their own success. By the mid-13th century, the Mongol Empire had conquered from the Pacific to Eastern Europe, yet its unity was already failing from within. To see how this massive structure fractured, we're going to map it out. For this exercise, you'll need a blank map of Eurasia and 4 different colored markers. We will use these to plot the specific boundaries of the empire's peak and the internal fault lines that eventually split it into 4 pieces. Tracking this decline provides a clear look at how a unified power survives expansion and what happens when it grows too large for any single person to control. On your map, draw a single border to enclose the territory from the Pacific shores all the way to the edge of Eastern Europe. Label this mid-13th century. No foreign army could match their heavy cavalry or their siege engines. Draw an arrow pushing westward from this border. In 1241, Mongol commanders were poised to enter the heart of the Western world. Instead, they turned their horses around. Mark the year 1241 with a red X in the center of the map. This represents the death of Ogedei Khan, which brought the Mongol war machine to a sudden halt. Mongol law required every prince and general to return to the capital of Karakoram for a Kurultai, a grand council to elect the next leader. While this mandatory gathering saved Europe from invasion, it forced a sprawling dynasty of rival grandsons into a single tense room. The resulting political infighting over the next few decades effectively ended the empire's unified expansion. Take your 4 colored markers. The political pressure eventually caused the empire to fracture into 4 separate domains, or khanates. We're going to partition the map now. In the northwest, covering Russia and Eastern Europe, color in the Golden Horde. They maintained the traditional Mongol lifestyle, ruling their subjects from horseback for centuries. In the southwest, shade in the Ilkhanate. This territory encompassed Persia and the Middle East, where the Mongol lords moved into grand Islamic palaces and adopted the local faith. In the center of the map, define the Chagatai Khanate. They remained in the rugged heart of Central Asia and viewed their urbanized cousins as corrupt. Finally, use your last color for the east. This is China, which became the Yuan dynasty. This geographical split ended the unified Mongol identity. Instead of conquering new lands, the 4 khanates began turning their deadly tactics inward, waging devastating civil wars against their own kin. Zoom in on the eastern zone and mark the new capital, Khanbalik, modern-day Beijing, with a star. This was the seat of Kublai Khan. He realized that while you can conquer a territory on horseback, you cannot govern a sophisticated civilization that way. He kept the existing Chinese bureaucracy in place and recruited specialists from across the globe to manage it. To stabilize the economy, Kublai oversaw the first widespread use of paper money, using sophisticated printing plates like these to manage the vast trade and agricultural output of the region. On your map, draw a jagged line between China and the Central Asian Khanate. This line represents a cultural break. By adopting Chinese customs and living in a palace, Kublai alienated his cousins in the steppe. To them, he was a traitor to his nomadic roots, ensuring the empire would never again act as one. Now, draw a long dashed line from Beijing to Baghdad and label it months of travel. Even with the fastest riders, the sheer scale of the empire made centralized control impossible. It is difficult to manage a crisis when a report of a rebellion takes half a year just to reach the leader. In the margins of your map, list the final factors that destabilized these regions. First was the plague, then came widespread famine, and finally peasant uprisings. In China, these pressures eventually drove the Mongols out of the country and back behind the Great Wall, leading to the rise of the Ming dynasty. The empire wasn't destroyed in one moment. Instead, the Mongol identity was swallowed by the cultures they had conquered. In Persia, they became sultans. In Russia, they became independent steppe lords, and in China, they became a discarded dynasty. Now, draw a thick golden line connecting the east to the west across the center of your map. Label this the Silk Road and the Pax Mongolica. By placing the entire Silk Road under one authority, the Mongols created a period of safe overland trade. Their postal system, the yam, allowed information and goods to move at speeds previously unknown. Place icons along this golden route for technologies that moved west under Mongol protection, specifically innovations like the printing press and the ancient bronze magnetic compass. Gunpowder also moved along this corridor. European nations would eventually take this Chinese innovation and use it to build the heavy iron cannons that defined a new era of warfare. In the corner of your map, add a final box in red. Record the human cost here. Millions died during the expansion, and entire cities like Baghdad were destroyed. These two realities exist side by side. The Mongols ended the isolation of the medieval world by bridging the gap between East and West, but the cost of that connectivity was the widespread destruction of the civilizations that stood in their way. Look at your completed map. You have plotted the transition from a single, isolated world to a series of interconnected domains. The map shows the paradox of the 13th century. The same distance and internal friction that broke the military empire were the forces that established a permanent trade network. These trade routes remained the standard for centuries. When Christopher Columbus sailed west, he was carrying a letter intended for the Great Khan, specifically attempting to reconnect with the trade links the Mongols had first opened. By forcing different civilizations into a single economic system, the Mongol era provided the template for the global exchange of technology and information we see today. To see how these specific innovations were adapted once they reached Europe, click the next video.